In the northern mountains of India there lies a small town called Rampur. Picturesque and serene, the town basks in sunlight during the day, illuminating its brick-red rooftops, while at night the starry sky shines so brightly that one might think they could reach out and touch the stars. Lena, one of Rampur's own, is a nurse at the town's hospital. At 24, she is both passionate and dedicated to her work. Despite the hospital's modest facilities, Lena's warm smile and skilled care bring comfort to every patient she attends. Her colleagues adore her, often referring to her as Rampur's angel of light. Outside of work, she enjoys simple pleasures like relaxing at a nearby cafe or taking walks with her parents, leading a life that is both quiet and fulfilling. On that fateful night in September 2016, Lena, as usual, spent her day busy working at the hospital. The emergency ward was flooded with patients, but she patiently attended to each one of them. Time flew by, and it was late at night when the hospital finally quieted down. Lena finished her shift, put on her coat, and prepared to head home. Stepping out of the hospital, she was greeted by the silent streets with an occasional car passing by. The dim street lights cast faint shadows, and she took a deep breath, feeling the cool air brushing against her face. Lena decided to walk home as she often did, rather than taking a ride. Her home was not far from the hospital, and the route was one she traveled daily. Despite the late hour, she felt no fear. Her town was always safe. She walked along the familiar path, passing the little shop she often frequented and the spots where she strolled with her parents. It was a comforting routine until she turned into a dimly lit alley. Just as she was about to step past the alley's entrance, shadows emerged from the darkness. Lena didn't sense the danger until a rough hand suddenly grabbed her arm, pulling her forcefully. Her breath quickened and her heart pounded violently. Instinctively, she tried to break free, but the hand gripping her arm was unyielding, like an iron clamp. Someone else covered her mouth with a towel from behind. Her vision blurred, and all she could hear were heavy, ragged breaths around her, amplifying her fear. "Stay quiet, girl!" A deep, menacing voice hissed in her ear, leaving no room for defiance. Lena struggled with all her might, but the attackers outnumbered her, their strength overwhelming. A chilling realization hit her. She was in grave danger. Her frantic gaze caught glimpses of the figures surrounding her. Among them, one stood out, a man in a white doctor's coat. Though the dim light made it hard to see clearly, she recognized him. It was Dr. Kapoor, a once respected surgeon at the hospital. Known to everyone as Dr. Kapoor, he was admired for his expertise and amiable nature, a seasoned figure in the medical field. Lena had worked with him several times and even regarded him as a mentor, but now this model doctor was one of her attackers. Kapoor's laugh was cold and devoid of empathy. He sneered, "Looks like today isn't your lucky day, Lena." With that, he shoved her roughly to the ground. The two other men, strangers to Lena, immediately joined in. She didn't know them, but she could feel their cruelty and callousness. Without giving her a chance to react, they rushed over and took off her clothes. Lena's body was pinned under the violent force of her assailants. Her head hit the ground with a painful thud, sending sharp pain coursing through her skull. She struggled with all her strength, but the three men overpowered her easily. Kapoor stood off to the side, watching with a sinister smile as the other two men took turns brutalizing her. Her throat felt crushed, and she could barely breathe. Her consciousness began to fade, with only the unbearable pain and terror keeping her aware. This nightmare was beyond anything she could have imagined. Lena had always believed that life in this quiet town was safe and secure, but now all of that was shattered as she endured the violence and heartlessness of these men. Time seemed to stand still in the darkness. Lena's spirit broke under the relentless assault, and her body was consumed by pain and despair. Kapoor and his accomplices showed no remorse. Like predators reveling in their prey's helplessness, they fed on her anguish. When the police arrived at the scene, Lena was already unconscious. She was rushed to the hospital for treatment, but Kapoor had vanished without a trace. The police launched an investigation immediately, but as time went on, the case seemed to grow increasingly complex. First, The evidence for the case was alarmingly scarce. Lena's phone contained no recordings or videos of Kapoor threatening her, and the towel bore no clear fingerprints or DNA traces. Even more troubling was the hospital's surveillance footage, which inexplicably experienced a malfunction. The footage that should have captured Lena leaving the hospital disappeared entirely during the crucial hour before the incident. All of this made the police feel increasingly helpless. Meanwhile, Kapoor went completely off the grid in the days following the incident. The police made several visits to the hospital looking for him, but failed to locate him. Kapoor's family and colleagues claimed he hadn't left his home during that period, and the hospital stated he had taken a sudden leave of absence due to pressing personal matters. Under mounting pressure, the police began to suspect there was more to this case than met the eye. The violent assault Lena endured seemed, on the surface, to be a straightforward personal crime, but all signs pointed to Kapoor, the model doctor. Yet, due to insufficient direct evidence, the case remained stalled. A few weeks later, the police were forced to release Kapoor based on the current evidence. Though he remained a suspect, the lack of solid proof made it impossible to detain him any longer. This decision left Lena utterly shocked and devastated. She had once regarded Kapoor as a highly respected doctor, only to realize too late that she had unwittingly allowed a monster to walk freely among people. Lena's heart sank into profound despair. Each day she moved back and forth between the hospital and her home, her mind plagued by the nightmare of that night. Although she tried to recover physically, she could not escape the psychological trauma. Every night, loneliness and fear surged through her like tidal waves. She began to doubt whether she would ever see justice. What pained her further was the reaction of her friends and colleagues, most of whom treated the case as an unsolvable tragedy. No one wanted to bring up what had happened that night, as if everything was already over, and Kapoor remained the respected doctor he had always been. Lena, however, was left as the troublesome victim in everyone's eyes. As time passed, Lena came to realize that the law and justice she had relied on felt fragile and distant. Her once steadfast belief began to crumble, replaced by an overwhelming sense of despair and helplessness. She started to question whether she would ever reclaim the justice she deserved, or if justice was an illusion she could never attain. After the case fell apart, Lena's life seemed to hit rock bottom. Both her body and mind were severely scarred, and the lingering psychological shadows made it impossible for her to continue working at the hospital. Although she had been an excellent nurse, the seeds of vengeance quietly sprouting within her drove her to leave everything she once knew behind and start anew. She found a job at a local pharmacy. While the work had little connection to her nursing background, it allowed her to temporarily distract herself from the pain of her past. During the day, she moved between the shelves, patiently answering customers' questions. At night, she returned to her modest apartment, where thoughts of revenge quietly brewed in her mind. Lena began to delve into pharmacology, studying the properties of various drugs and their toxicology. She needed to figure out how to make Kapoor pay for his actions without leaving a trace. A single thought lingered in her mind. She had to take revenge and make Kapoor suffer for the pain she had endured. Over time, this idea became clearer and more resolute. Lena knew she could no longer endure being ignored and belittled. Over the course of several months, she familiarized herself with the effects and reactions of various medications, gradually mastering how to concoct substances that appeared harmless but could be lethal. Lena realized that in order to make Kapoor fall into her trap unknowingly, she had to approach him without arousing suspicion. She decided to harness the power of social media and created a fake identity and account. Using this new persona, she reached out to Kapoor and began to establish contact online. She intentionally adopted a gentle tone in her conversations, asking him medical questions and pretending to admire him greatly. Kapoor, oblivious to the lurking danger, seemed pleased to engage with this new friend, even confiding in her about some of his personal dilemmas. Lena smirked inwardly. Kapoor was still as arrogant and complacent as ever, utterly unaware of the threat in his midst. During this period, Lena built a relatively stable connection with Kapoor in the virtual world, while her heart burned with the flames of vengeance. She continued to refine her plan, determined to ensure every step was executed flawlessly. Lena knew that once she set her revenge in motion, there would be no turning back. Failure was not an option, as it would mean she might never achieve the justice she sought. Lena grew increasingly cautious, distancing herself from everything in her real life as though she had entered an entirely different world. Her heart became consumed with cold determination. Every night she immersed herself in the intricate details of her plan, revisiting every possible scenario to ensure its success. Lena was no longer the gentle, kind nurse she once was. She was transforming into a machine of vengeance, methodically advancing toward the target who had caused her so much suffering. In October 2017, Lena's plan for revenge finally reached its execution stage. After months of preparation, she was convinced that every detail was meticulously arranged and that Kapoor could no longer escape her trap. She used the fake relationship she had built with Kapoor to cleverly lure him to a seemingly casual meeting, coaxing him to visit an abandoned house alone. That night, Lena put on her best attire and stepped out of her modest apartment, her heart pounding wildly. She had been waiting too long for this moment. Finally, all the pain and waiting would come to an end. She knew that tonight she was not the gentle nurse she once was. She was now the embodiment of revenge, cold, decisive, and merciless. Using social media, she contacted Kapoor one last time, telling him she had something private to discuss with him. Kapoor readily agreed, his growing interest and attention towards Lena leaving him oblivious to the trap he was stepping into. Lena feigned dependence on Kapoor, revealing a sense of unease and seeking his support, leading Kapoor to believe she was a vulnerable woman in need of his protection. Their meeting place was on the outskirts of the town, at a long-abandoned house. The location was far from the bustling city with no nearby residences. Lena knew this spot was perfect. No surveillance cameras, no witnesses, just the ideal site for her act of vengeance. Kapoor arrived as agreed, stepping into the dilapidated house. Lena was already waiting at the door, wearing a seemingly anxious and uneasy expression to greet him. Using her usual gentle tone, she chatted with Kapoor, attempting to lower his guard. Once he sat down, she subtly mixed a prepared drug into the drink she had offered him. The drug's effects took hold quickly, and Kapoor's gaze began to blur as he gradually lost consciousness. Before Kapoor completely passed out, Lena swiftly dragged him into a more concealed corner of the house. Calmly observing his weakening form, she felt no trace of pity. From her bag, she retrieved the ropes and tools she had prepared in advance, commencing the carefully planned torment. She didn't rush to end his life, instead ensuring Kapoor endured every bit of pain she had once suffered. Her hands left countless marks on his body, and in his fading eyes she saw helplessness and fear. Yet she remained unmoved. Each act of torture, each infliction of pain, provided her with a grim sense of justice. Finally, when Lena was certain that Kapoor's vitality was almost completely drained, she ended it all without hesitation. She checked his pulse again to confirm his death, and then quickly began to clean the scene. First, she used cleaning tools she had prepared to wipe away every drop of blood from the floor and furniture. She carefully erased any fingerprints or traces, ensuring the place looked untouched before anyone else arrived. When everything was done, Lena wrapped Kapoor's body in a plastic bag she had brought and carried it outside. Skillfully, she hid the corpse in an abandoned area, ensuring it wouldn't be discovered anytime soon. She then destroyed all items that could connect her to the crime: medication bottles, tools, clothing, leaving no trace behind. At last, Lena quietly left the abandoned house as if she had never been there. She didn't look back, walking steadily down her chosen path. The night sky above remained silent, dotted with stars. No one knew that the man who had once driven her to despair had now disappeared forever in the corners of this small town. Lena's revenge was complete, yet her heart felt no relief or satisfaction, only coldness and emptiness. She knew that this act couldn't change the pain of the past, but at least Kapoor would no longer harm innocent people. Leaving the abandoned house, she carried on with her life, though the darkness within her lingered like a nightmare she could never escape. The day after Kapoor's body was discovered, the atmosphere in the small town grew unusually tense. The police, responding to the report, quickly dispatched detectives to the scene to examine every detail of the abandoned house. Though the area seemed to have been meticulously cleaned, experienced forensic officers soon noticed some unusual traces. Kapoor's body had been roughly hidden in a corner, suggesting a deliberate attempt to cover something up. A closer inspection revealed no signs of self-defense around the victim, and the manner of death did not resemble a sudden act of violence. The police began reviewing Kapoor's background, focusing on his relationships, particularly with Lena. As the investigation progressed, they learned that Lena had worked at the hospital for many years before abruptly resigning and starting over at a local pharmacy. This sudden change aroused the police's suspicion, prompting them to track her recent activities. At first, Lena's behavior seemed entirely ordinary, leaving the investigators with no concrete leads. However, as they delved deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. The detectives reviewed Lena's social media accounts and discovered frequent interactions between her and Kapoor, especially after she left her job at the hospital. These interactions indicated that not only had they been in contact for professional reasons, but Lena had also actively reached out to Kapoor via social media and arranged several meetings after her resignation. Even more alarming was the discovery of her pharmacy records, which showed that she had purchased drugs capable of immobilizing and quickly killing someone. Investigators suspected that these substances were part of a carefully premeditated plan. Adding to their case, they found a diary among Lena's personal belongings. In it, she had documented her emotional journey from being victimized by Kapoor to her decision to seek revenge. Her detailed entries revealed the depth of her pain and anger, as well as her meticulous planning for the retribution. The police compiled all the evidence and finally identified Lena as their primary suspect. She was formally arrested and brought in for questioning. When confronted, Lena did not deny her actions. She calmly recounted the entire sequence of events, describing how she had used social media to reconnect with Kapoor, carefully planned each step, and ultimately carried out her revenge. Lena's confession left everyone present utterly stunned. She showed no sign of regret, instead speaking with composure about how she had descended into despair and then meticulously orchestrated everything. She told the police that her actions were not merely about killing Kapoor, but about making him pay for his past deeds. Her voice didn't waver, as though she were recounting an ordinary story. News of the case spread quickly across the small town, and Lena's cold determination shocked everyone. Those who had known her found it impossible to reconcile the calm, composed woman before them with the warm, dedicated nurse she once was. The tranquility of the town was shattered, transforming a place once thought immune to such events into a backdrop for fear and uncertainty. Lena's act of revenge sent shockwaves through the town, sparking intense debates about justice, vengeance, and humanity. Meanwhile, the police delved deeper into her motives and background, searching for additional clues. Every detail of her confession and the case plunged the town into a long and profound contemplation. Lena's trial drew immense attention in the town's courthouse. Residents flocked to the courtroom, eager to witness the proceedings of a once respected nurse who had now become a cold and calculated avenger. The atmosphere inside and outside the court was tense, with media outlets competing to report on this sensational case. In court, Lena sat in the defendant's chair, her gaze calm and resolute. She showed no sign of guilt or anxiety as she faced questions from the judge and jury. Her lawyer attempted to defend her by arguing that her actions stemmed from overwhelming emotional trauma and profound psychological distress, but Lena made no effort to conceal her true feelings. When the judge asked if she regretted her actions, Lena's response shocked everyone. She calmly replied, "I have no regrets because everything I did was to make him pay for his crimes." He took everything from me, and society offered no protection." Her voice was steady, but her words were filled with conviction. She went on to stress that her decision to seek revenge was driven by the failure of society to protect women. When she suffered injustice, there was no one to stand up for her. She asserted that on that fateful night, Kapoor had become the nightmare of her life, and the law's inefficiency and inability to provide justice had pushed her into despair, ultimately leading her down the path of vengeance. Lena's statement stirred intense reactions in the courtroom. Some people in the audience nodded silently, seemingly understanding her pain and anger. Others frowned, believing her actions were too extreme. While her plea struck an emotional chord with many, the judge and prosecutor remained focused on the legal ramifications. The court ultimately ruled that while Lena's actions could be understood from an emotional perspective, she could not escape responsibility under the law. She was found guilty of premeditated murder, but considering her prolonged psychological trauma at the time of the crime, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. At the same time, Kapoor's accomplice's case was reopened. Through Lena's confession and the police investigation, authorities uncovered evidence of Kapoor's and his partner's illegal dealings and crimes. Not only were they involved in illicit activities, but they also had multiple records of sexual assault. With the case reinvestigated, the court convicted Kapoor's accomplices, sentencing them to life imprisonment as well for their involvement in murder and other crimes. The trial's outcome sparked widespread social debate. Opinions about Lena were sharply divided. Many saw her as a victim, especially among women, who recognized her helplessness within the social and legal system. They empathized with her lack of support after enduring violence and being driven to the extreme by despair. Others, however, argued that while Lena's plight was tragic, her chosen method of revenge was excessively cruel and utterly unacceptable within the framework of the law. They believed her actions, no matter how justified emotionally, could not absolve her of guilt or reduce her responsibility. Violence, they contended, should never be the answer to societal failings. When the court's verdict was announced, all eyes were on Lena. She showed no visible reaction, as if she had already come to terms with her fate. She bowed her head, silently exiting the courtroom, bearing the weight of her actions and the price of her revenge. The town's residents were left deep in thought. Was Lena truly a victim who strayed down a destructive path for revenge? Or did her actions reveal a darker side of human nature, exposing the systemic failure to protect victims? The question remained unanswered. The town's tranquility was shattered, but the ensuing discussions lingered, leaving a lasting impact. Although the court's ruling provided a legal conclusion, whether it was enough to drive societal change or awaken those who had yet to suffer remained an open question.